I've been thinking about how to do this video for the last few days or so because I want to talk about a lot of things that are going on in Season 4, from basically my PTR testing as well as Wowhead news articles, but I also wanted to make a video talking about Brewmaster, and since I've been getting a lot of requests about my opinion on Brewmaster, how it's feeling next season, best in slot items, I think in this video I'm going to address mostly my testing and experience so far in the PTR for Brewmaster for Season 4, how it's shaping up, and then in the future I'll go over more general Season 4 content, I guess. Just the other day, Blizzard has actually announced that Season 4 will be starting on April 23rd. I believe that's a Tuesday. I should fact check that. It's just 3 weeks away, so without further ado, let's just jump into my general thoughts on Brewmaster. So there's a few things to note about Season 4 that it's going to be a little different than previous seasons throughout Dragonflight. So for those who aren't aware, maybe didn't play in Shadowlands, this next upcoming season is what we call a Fated season. Essentially, we're going to be kind of re-exploring the raids that we've seen so far over Dragonflight, and we're going to have the new dungeon pool for this season basically just being Dragonflight dungeons, the classic 8s, ignoring the Mega Dungeon. So that has a couple interesting things at play there. First off, with all the raids now being accessible at a new item level and a new max item level, well, you're going to have a ton of different gear to choose from. There's going to be a ton of very powerful trinkets, raid items, and dungeon loot, etc. So we need to kind of look at the Brewmaster as a whole and look at this class that is notorious for utilizing and abusing borrowed power systems. Also, if you don't remember, we did vote as a community on which tier sets are going to be brought back or implemented for Season 4 for every class and spec. And Brewmasters, for better or for worse, voted on the Season 3 tier set. So if you're looking for a change in Brewmaster playstyle, this might not be the best patch. You might be kind of hoping for a change of pace in the War Within expansion coming up in a few months now. So we're going to be pretty much playing the same build. It's going to be the extra Shadow Flame damage via Charred Dreams, along with that kind of that Fire Leech healing is the best way I can describe the set. It's a very strong set. It feels very good in this next season, especially with bloated secondary stats and main stat, but it is the same playstyle. So if you're looking for a change, probably not the best case. But here I am on the PTR server, and there's a few things I kind of want to talk about. What's really cool for Brewmaster going to this next season with it being Fated is we're going to have access to a Dinar system similar to Shadowlands. If you weren't familiar with what the Dinar system was, it was a specific type of currency in the Fated season for Shadowlands, which allowed players to kill raid bosses, and once you killed a set amount of raid bosses based off of a quest that you would get, you were given a token of Dinar, and that Dinar token would be able to be turned in for any piece of raid loot that you desire. And essentially it was a way to have like bad luck protection. Because of a rotating raid schedule, you had limited access to certain items, so this allowed players to target things that either wouldn't drop on the given week that the raid was available, or if they just wanted to bolster up their off spec. Now the problem in Shadowlands specifically was that you were only allowed 3 total Dinar tokens for your character, and they were time gated, and there was no catch-up system. So if you started late, you'd still have to kill all the bosses, and if you played all 3 specs, or maybe you wanted to play around with different items, you essentially had to farm them and get lucky from raid because you weren't going to be able to afford all of them. And then for some classes like Druid, let's say you were a Druid player who plays Guardian, Resto, Balance, and Feral, you weren't getting any of the gear that you wanted because you're playing 4 specs which had different stats, different stat weights that you preferred, obviously different trinkets. An intellect healer trinket is different from a agility damage trinket versus an agility tank trinket. It was just a mess. We don't know a lot about the Dinar system currently, but some players noticed, myself included, that on the PTR, the weekly dungeon quest for completing 4 mythic dungeons did award 2 of the Dinar tokens, which is what it would cost to buy an item. So coming back to this PTR here, there's a lot of cool items from the raid that I'm not gonna lie, I kind of forgot about. We have things like Seal of Darun is Chosen, which causes our fire damage to have a chance to apply a dot, which will tick for additional damage over 6 seconds, I believe. We also had Seal of Filial Duty. This was your fire damage or dealing fire damage had a chance to invigorate you, giving you a small absorption shield for 6 seconds. This is actually pretty massive. It was about 260k. And this can proc pretty frequently, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit. We also have a lot of cool damage and tank trinkets. Something like Decoration of Flame was easily accessible for a lot of players since it came off the first raid boss. It was a very powerful addition to a class's kit for Snap Threat, and it also provided a pretty luxurious absorption shield for tanks. Things like Alto to Master are returning, which is pretty powerful for Blood Death Knight if I remember correctly, due to parry chances. You have things like Manic Grief Torch coming back, you have Beacon from Beyond, Dragonfire Bomb Dispenser. There's such an insane amount of trinkets coming back because of the accessibility to all 3 raids that tanking, and specifically for the Brewmaster, is going to be very fun. Now, based on the Dinar acquisition, which we still haven't confirmed yet, the only thing that we know, and we don't even know if this is true or not or if it's a bug, but we're going to be getting it from our weekly quest for Mythic Dungeons, and we're going to assume it's going to work somewhat similar to how it worked in Shadowlands, where it's going to require you to raid. Now, you might get 1 per raid boss kill, you might get 1 based off of some type of weekly quest, it might be something like Sparks, where you're going to get 1 or 2 every week or every other week. We don't know quite yet how they're going to work. Wowhead hasn't been able to data mine it, and Blizzard hasn't come forward yet. But basically, even if you weren't raiding, you can still access these by just doing Mythic Plus, as long as it isn't a bug, which is really good news. They've also included some changes to some of these popular trinkets from Season 1 and Season 2. Granite's Enduring Scale, for example, is no longer a passive. For those who played in Season 1, this was a very strong trinket. It would proc off of damage taken and have a chance to just give you an absorb per tick, which is pretty nice. And then if that shield bursted, it would then deal damage. I don't think I phrased that right at all, but essentially it was a passive trinket, and now it's an on use. The on use, though, is really cool. So you have a 75% damage reduction for 20 seconds, which is massive, and I can only imagine how nutty this might be in PvP, but you have a 75% damage reduction for 20 seconds or until 900 total damage has been absorbed, and then during this time your armor is increased while the shield holds, and then every time you're struck by an ability, you're going to gain additional armor up to 20 stacks. And then once this is broken or expires, it's going to deal a little burst of damage. Now, through my testing personally, this was just a strong trinket to use on cooldown, and it was providing about a 10 to 15% damage or healing increase based on the dungeon. And the damage it was providing was anywhere between like 1 and 2%, so a little bit on the lower end, but still a very solid tank trinket. Now, what I was a little bit concerned of coming into this season in particular was the lack of tank trinkets, because in theory, we are no longer going to have access to the Prophetic Stone Scales from Mythic Plus. You can still farm it on M0, you can do it on hard mode, but it is going to be a weekly lockout, and you kind of have to get lucky, of course. You have to kill a Ridicron in that dungeon, you have to be rolling tank spec, and then you have to have it to drop, which is going to be pretty difficult to do. I would recommend farming it from Season 3 if you don't have it yet, because having it in your arsenal will be just good to have. But coming into this season, I was a little concerned because the only tank trinket I can think of that was very strong was Fearax Tainted Rageheart. But with Granite Scale now being an on use for 75% DR, very strong. The cooldown's a little high, I would say. Maybe a minute and a half could make this a little bit more competitive. But 2-minute cooldown for this can definitely be planned around a 75% DR going into a pull. Rotating this with maybe Rageheart or some other tank trinkets might be very valuable. So I'm pretty excited about this one. We're also seeing the return of Treemout's Festering Splinter. This is going to be doing the same effect it did in Season 2. It's going to do a little bit of damage to you. It's able to be staggered off, and it's going to be providing you with a massive 50% DR for a total of 1.6 million damage taken for 15 seconds. And this has a minute and a half cooldown. So while Granite Scale did get a rework, and I like it a lot, and it can do damage, you're going to be trading this out for probably Treemout's Festering Splinter for survivability, though Treemouth doesn't do damage. So got to keep that in mind. Another trinket that got reworked that I've been loving because it's passive is Inexorable Resonator. Now, some of you might remember this trinket. It was really bad. I liked testing it on Blood Death Knight back on Dragonflight Beta like 2 years ago now. They reworked this trinket in a few ways. First off, you no longer have to fall below 50% health. It's now 75% health, which is pretty easy to do as a Brewmaster because of how the dynamics of stagger. You're going to take damage pretty quickly, especially when you're trying to get shuffle rolling. You're going to drop below 75% health, and when that happens, you're going to activate basically a buff on yourself called the Defense Matrix. This is going to absorb 50% of the incoming damage you take up to a maximum of 600k. And while the shield persists, you're going to be pulsing AoE fire damage to all enemies around you. And this can occur every 1.5 minutes. It used to be 2 or 3 minutes, and it used to be 50%, and the damage used to be a little bit lower, if I'm not mistaken, based off of scaling. So this trinket being reworked, especially for Brewmaster, is doing about 4% of my overall damage, and it's doing about 10% of my overall healing. So when you kind of take that into account, adding those two up, you're getting about a 14% value of your class out of it. That's the way that I like to look at it, compared to some of these other things where you might get 15% healing out of Tree Mouth, but you're not gaining any damage. Or you might be gaining 10% out of Granite and healing and only 2% damage. So the way that I like to look at it is, if in terms of value, if you add up these percentages, you can kind of gauge to yourself the value of the trinket. So these trinkets being reworked, incredible. And then of course we have your classic raid trinkets are still going to be here. You're going to be able to get Ferox Tainted Rage Heart, Augury's coming back for damage, Cataclysm Brand, Twisted Blade. All of these are very strong for the Brewmaster in terms of damage. You can definitely pump out a lot of big numbers with this. But when you're looking for the tankiness of the class, you're going to get a lot of that from Seal of Filial Duty, Inexorable Resonator, and Ferox Tainted Rage Heart. The last couple things that I'm pretty excited for too are going to be things like Forge Storm. Forge Storm is coming back, and yes, I know you don't get main stat from it, but with the kind of bell curve on main stat in terms of stagger scaling, we're getting to the point where you can probably afford dropping a little bit of agility for something that's going to just straight up do, based on RNG, it could be your top boss damage on some fights. But generally speaking, it's going to be anywhere between 4 to 6% of your overall. It's a very powerful item. Dropping the main set is not a big deal. We also have things like Thorncaller's Claw, which this coming back with Forge Storm allows us to have a very, very powerful dual wield setup, because they're both unique equipped, but they both have their own individual effects. I'm stoked for this. Brewmaster is falling back into that. We have a ton of borrowed power from trinkets, weapons, and rings, but also at the same time being a class that likes to fumble around with weapons of order being one of our major cooldowns, it's kind of fitting in a way. So long story short, there are just so many items coming forward in this next patch for the Brewmaster Monk. So while the playstyle is changing the same, the class is going to be doing a ton of damage and a ton of healing. So really quick, I do want to talk about the Dinar system really quick. If you're in Valdrakken, this is where you're going to access it. We're going to be heading over to the Bronze Enclave, directly across from the Engine of Innovation. So we're going to head straight over here, and this is where you're going to find the vendors for all your loot. So here's the Engine of Innovation. From people who played in Season 1, you're probably going to remember this area from where you gathered your sparks and did your weekly spark quests, or bi-week, or every other week. And then straight across, there is going to be this room. But in here, you're going to find a handful of vendors. You're going to find vendors for the first raid, the second raid, and the third raid, who are going to sell you these items on a progression track that is awakened 1 through 12. Getting it to rank 12 will get it all the way up to the max item level of, I believe it's 528. So this is going to come from using crests. You can buy everything from just your simple offhands to these powerful trinkets, to weapons, and just everything in between. So there's the first raid, Vault of the Incarnates. You have Aberrus, the Shadowed Crucible, things like Beacon from Beyond, Voice of the Silent Star, very powerful cloak, Bomb Dispenser. All of this stuff is going to be accessible to each and every player via these vendors based off of this antique bronze bullion. You can actually see that I have 2 in my inventory. This is from last week. This is the currency here. So it's going to cost you 2 per item. But based off of the fact that the weekly quest gave me just 2, I would imagine that you're probably going to be gaining 2 every week, every other week. Again, we don't know if there's going to be a set limit on it. The speculation is that they're moving away from that set limit, and the reason why is because they also added a transmog vendor. To get the Jigglesworth Senior, which was I think the kind of feat of strength mount from doing this in Shadowlands by killing every raid boss, I think on heroic difficulty, you can now buy this mount for 3 of these. And then you can pretty much spend this currency on any of the transmog items from any of the raids in any color. So let's say you just never did LFR, maybe you just skipped right into Heroic and Mythic, or you never got the chance to do Mythic. You can buy the Mythic colored variations of these items from this vendor. So here's the staff, for example. So I think this is the normal version, LFR, normal, Heroic, and Mythic. So you're now going to be able to buy all these. So the big speculation is we believe that we're going to gain I would say at least 10 of these per character, if not more, throughout the patch. So that's good news for both people who are looking to fully optimize their kit, looking to experiment with different specs in their given class, or just to collect transmog, which is great. And then last but not least, we are going to be able to buy our tier sets as well. Now, there's a lot of questions about what secondary stats are going to be on these tier items. Now, from what I can tell, I haven't looked at my other characters, but it looks like depending on what transmog you voted for is going to affect the secondary stats. So it looks like we're going back to the Season 1 secondary stats on these items for our characters. Not that it's the value from Season 1, but it's the secondary stats. So it's like crit mastery or haste verse or whatever it might be. So in the case of the Brewmaster, we'll probably be ignoring the helm slot when looking for tier. We're going to be looking for shoulders, chests, legs, and gloves, and we're going to be ignoring helm, which will open up options to bring back things like flare and cowl for damage, especially for like things like the Windwalker monk. You might end up just going and putting a toxic patch on it. You might be playing something like Lariat instead. It's kind of still up in the air. I haven't looked too much into embellishments, but in terms of itemization, in terms of secondary stats, you're probably going to ignore the helm only because it's very, very high haste, which based off of some of the other gear we might be leaning towards, like Seal of Filial Duty, we're going to be getting plenty of haste from our weapons and our rings that we're not going to need to worry about having haste on our helm. Okay, so last but not least, Brewmaster feels really good. I've had a lot of people asking me how Brewmaster is feeling in Season 4, if it's going to be any, better than it is currently, if it's going to be quote-unquote meta. Definitely not. I don't see a world where it's going to be meta, only because it still lacks the utility that's going to be required in some of these dungeons. Or, I shouldn't say required, but preferred by a lot of groups. Don't get me wrong, Brewmaster can perform at the top end. You have people like Mordrum and Equinox who are going to perform extremely well in the class. There's obviously other Brewmasters that play up there too, but those are the two people who always come to mind when I think of Brewmaster. Those types of players are going to be able to really accelerate on the class, but generally speaking, we're going back to a dungeon like Ruby Life Pools, where we're probably going to want a lot of Sigil of Silences or Avenger Shields. We're going to Neltharis, where there's a lot of really heavy either physical or magical tank busters where Brewmasters can struggle, and especially with changes to how the chains work in Neltharis, probably going to be struggling. A lot of casts and kind of bleed effects from Halls of Infusion, probably going to be a little bit of a struggle. Don't get me wrong, there's dungeon nerfs coming in, but because of the lack of utility, or I should say because things like Brewmaster or Prot Warrior and stuff are so far behind Avenger Shield versus like Sigil of Silence, probably not going to be meta. Does it do a lot of damage? Hell yeah. Does it have insane survivability now because of Seal of Filial Duty and some of these trinket reworks? You betcha. Class play is the same. Trinkets and borrowed power items are going to be great. Does a lot of damage. Will perform generally well in most instances, but requires high APM, a little bit more of a button bloat compared to other tanks, so there's a lot of active abilities you have to constantly hit. And generally speaking, it's going to feel just the same as it always has, I guess. So I am excited for Season 4, but I will be honest, I'm way more excited for alpha and beta testing to become available for not only content creators that I like to watch when I get to start seeing how alpha works, but once beta comes out too, normally I'm in there testing. So we'll see. I'm a little bit more excited for that kind of stuff, but Season 4 is looking and shaping up to be a pretty fun season to maybe come back or as a good send-off. So I hope that clarifies my stance on Brewmaster and what it's looking like going to the next season. If you have any questions or any specific things you'd like me to address, leave them in the comments below and I'll try to get to them as soon as I can. I'm looking at doing a Season 4 kind of recap on all the big things that are changing going into the next season, so maybe you guys can get caught up on that. But for the most part, that's how I feel about Brewmaster. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Big shout out to my Patreons. I know it's been a little slow, but now that Season 4 is picking up and beta is going to start kicking off, there's going to be a lot more content. So I hope you guys are all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.